to what feels like my first video in a while. Actually my first video in 8 months, and in today's video I'm going to be covering a problem that I used to face and sort of getting answers to it. That issue being not seeing any sort of substantial growth in the koi that you purchase. I've had this one myself in the first years of keeping fish, and albeit you buy a toe size and then in 2 years it's grown to me about 4 or 5 inches, or that being you buy a slightly larger fish, maybe a knee size, and you're seeing very limited growth. Now, this problem isn't as easy to fix as you thought. You know, people will say things and give you tips, but realistically it's not as simple as you may think, and it's simple changes, but you have to do quite a few different changes. Although they are simple, you have to implement all of them to get the desired sort of change in your fish. So in today's video I'm going to be covering methods I use to sort of grow my fish in this pond here, and you know, I'll give out different methods that I found work for me, and obviously you can try them out on your pond. Now the first factor is space. Now I think the first most obvious thing is the space you give the koi. Now this is actually the problem that I had with my pond. I originally had actually these fish here, as you can see here, these tosai here, which I purchased. I had them in quite a small tub when I first got them, and I didn't see a lot of growth, and that has actually resulted now in a lot of these being a lot smaller than they should have been at this age. So you see, like this one here, for example, should have been about this size by now, but because of my smaller tank at the time, I simply wasn't able to grow them out. Now, what I'm saying here is that it doesn't mean you have to buy a huge tank like this one, which is 7 foot by 4 foot. It simply means buying the right amount of fish for the tank you have. So, for example, you know, I'm not saying to go out and spend loads of money, but just make sure that you aren't overstocking your tanks. For example, this tank does look slightly overstocked, and that's because it slightly is at the moment. With these larger fish here, I've just brought in because they're just sort of underfed in the pond, the main pond. There's a lot of fish in my main pond, but I brought those inside. But there's a lot of depth to this tank, so there's a lot of space back here that they're not populating. But yeah, space is sort of the main factor, because if you're giving a fish a larger area to swim, it's obviously going to have more area to grow, and then more area to sort of feel less stressed out. Now, another thing you might want to watch out for is understocking your tank. If you have a tank of this size and you chuck in 2 fish, you'll think, oh, I'm going to get loads of growth from my fish, they're going to be huge. And what you actually find is they're actually much higher chance of being a lot slower growth than having, say, 20 or 30 fish in the tank. And the simple reason for that is these koi feel a lot safer eating in large groups than they do eating on their own. See this fish here, they notice this one starts coming up to the top. This one's very friendly, but as they notice this one starts eating, they all feel confident to come up, which is why this one was put in here originally. So it's really about finding the right balance for your tank. There's plenty of things online sort of to give you ideas, the sort of fish you should have per litre, but yeah, the first thing you should be careful of is stocking the right amount of fish your size, your tank. Not too many, that it's overstocked, but not too little, so they're too scared to come up to eat. Now the next factor is filtration and water changes. Now the second and most obvious thing is obviously filtration. You know, if you have a larger tank and a lot of fish, it's always better to have more filtration than less. Now, filtration actually isn't as hard as people think it is. One thing I've always said is, you need to go out and buy these big expensive drum filters with loads of that will cost you thousands just because they remove the muck. You don't have to do that. I mean, I've got homemade filters outside my pond, which I can put photos up in a second of. You know, you can do filtration quite cheap, but it's about the volume of biomedia and the sort of what you have inside the filter. So in here, it's split into 3 places, and for context, this is about 1/4 of the water that's in the tank. That's honestly over filtration. I don't have to do that much, but because I had a larger filter lying around, you know, I'm going to use it. I mean, you can't over-filtrate a tank. It's only going to be better for the fish inside. And filtration is key because it gets rid of the ammonia, and the biobacteria will break down the ammonia, and it'll just keep the fish nice and healthy in the tank. And then the other thing I'll also say is if you're in an area that's in constant sunlight, like I am, you're going to need a UV light. I've got a UV light back here. This requires literally no maintenance whatsoever. I just have it on the first bit there. Water goes in, the UV light kills any algae in the water, and it just gets rid of that green tinge. They sell a lot of products that you can do that with, but I find if you buy an old UV, in the end it ends up costing less than it does to buy those products. So the key thing is really filtration and using a UV light, because if you have enough filtration for the fish, they're going to be much healthier, the water parameters will be perfect. Of course, do constant testing and water changes, Water changes you should be doing at least, depends. I tend to do one once a week, but I'll bring it down a very limited amount and fill it back up. You can do one once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks, but you've got to increase the amount you do. Water changes and filtration are key. And also with cleaning your filter, I always recommend you don't clean the entire thing, because if you clean the entire thing, you're going to kill off so much biomedia. So these two sections here are simply for filtration, and the end one's for biomedia. This one never gets cleaned. Otherwise, if I did clean it, all the biomedia would die. So I recommend you only clean, say, the filtration side, and leave the biomedia side clean. So if you keep off your filtration and your water changes, your water parameters will be perfect for the fish to grow, and they'll get the optimum growth rate. Now this next bit is probably one of the most important sections because it's so easy to get wrong. I've got it wrong. Everyone will get it wrong, but you've just got to make sure that you pay perfect attention to this section. And that section being feeding your fish. Now feeding is something that will often result in either your fish not growing or your fish dying. And you get two ends of the spectrum here. You get people who underfeed or overfeed. And honestly, both are as worse as each other. Now, the thing is with feeding, it's very easy to overfeed your fish because I've done it before. You just come in here, they're all at the top like this, very hungry. They all want to come up and bite your finger, and you think, oh, I've just got to feed them. And you keep doing it. This one's really thin out, this fish. But they keep doing it, you keep doing it, and then eventually the water parameters cannot hold the amount of ammonia going into the tank, and the fish will eventually get unhealthy and die. And also underfeeding. You know, if you're not feeding your fish enough, they're not going to be getting enough nutrition to fill their bodies, and they're just going to be undergrown and come up with deformities. They're going to get malnourished, and they're just not going to be very healthy, happy fish. Honestly, feeding isn't that hard. If you feed them at least once a day and give them enough that they can eat within less than 5 minutes, this should be okay. And also a varied amount of items you feed them. So see, the feed I recommend obviously to feed is pellets. Now the size pellets I use are 3mm. Realistically, you want to feed a pellet that is the right size for the smallest fish in your pond. Big fish don't really care. So I've seen people who will buy the huge pellets, and there's really no need for that. Small pellets are just a lot better. You always get a pellet that your smallest fish can eat quite comfortably. The big fish aren't too fast. I'm actually going to feed my fish now. They haven't been fed today. Now I can just give them a handful because I know now how much they need. But if you watch, you know your fish are happy and healthy if they come up to eat out of your hand like this. And as you can see, they're clearly very happy to feed. And that's a good sign that you have healthy fish, when they're fully up at the top all the time, they're not worried about you. And this is behaviour you will often get when you have a lot of fish in the tank. But realistically, you want to make sure that you're feeding the right amount to your fish. Now, like I said, feed enough that they'll eat it in less than 5 minutes, and do it at least once a day. And if you really need to in the heat of summer, when it's really optimum temperatures, maybe twice a day. And also in the winter, when it gets below 10 degrees, they really don't need feeding at all. Because in the winter, the metabolism slows down. And as it gets cooler, just feed them less and less and less. And in the winter, I will already give them a pinch every other day, just to see if they're even hungry, because they won't even be hungry most of the time, especially in the UK with our cold weather in the winter. If it gets below 10 degrees, they really don't need feeding at all. And yeah, so just get your feeding right, and it won't overload the pond with ammonia. A sign of that would just be your fish look very lethargic and unhealthy. And doing tests as well, you've got to be on top of your tests. And if you don't overfeed, nor do you underfeed, and you get it just right, they'll have enough nutrition to grow their bodies out. The next factor is oxygenation. This next point is actually a very forgotten point, and that's oxygenation in the pond. A lot of new people get into the hobby will actually forget this section, and although they can get away with it, it actually can stunt the growth of your koi and limit the amount of fish you can put in a tank. You need to make sure your pond's oxygenated. As you can see here, I've got an air stone that runs in the pond. And oxygenation just means that the fish are going to have enough oxygen for themselves. Because see, fish breathe in their water. You know, because you get with a lot of the hobbyists, a lot of mistakes you might make because you won't do an oxygenator. Now, you may think that these sort of bubbles that come out of here and here are enough for the koi. Just to give you context. I used to think this as well. And I used to think those bubbles that come out of here and here are enough oxygenation for the fish. And the truth is they're not. Especially in the heat of summer, because as the water heats up, more oxygen will diffuse out of the water. So oxygenation is key in sort of the growth of the fish, and just make sure that you have enough oxygen running in the pond to sort of help with the growth, and that'll help speed the growth up of the koi. The final factor is heating. Now the final factor is optional, and that is just heat. Heat isn't too important with koi growth. You don't have to heat your pond. I don't heat my ponds, but it does help. I found the optimum temperature is about 23 degrees. Anything above that, it's not great for them. Anything below that, and they'll eat less. But like I said, this factor is really optional. I've got outdoor ponds, they're not heated, and the fish in there still grow completely fine. These ones in here have grown slightly faster though, from being inside. Now I heat with this polytunnel here. It does mean I can't make it at temperature exactly, but it keeps the